Welcome to our first lesson with coffee and U.S. history in the kitchen with Mr. Evans. I want to open with a few big themes and big ideas. And one is something you're all wondering: why are textbooks so boring? Well, here's the thing. Because U.S. history textbooks present history as fact. History is not facts. History is not about memorizing details. History is a mystery, and that's what makes it fun. What we're going to discover is oftentimes there's a lot of mystery, and historians have to act like detectives and piece together the evidence they have to come up with a story. And then that story sometimes becomes the myths and the legends that dominate our culture, even though then later we find out, maybe there's more evidence, or maybe there's a different way we could look at that same story. So let's start with a perfect example of this, right? The Mayflower. Steeped in the mythology of America, right? The Mayflower landing at Plymouth Rock, and the Mayflower Compact, and how these gritty little Christians were escaping persecution and founded a free America, free for religion. Well, there's a lot more to the story than that, right? So first off, there were actually two ships that were supposed to be bound for America, and one of them sprung a leak and had to return to England. It couldn't make the voyage. Only about a third of the passengers on board were actually part of the Christian separatists. A lot were crew, some were hired workers, laborers. They weren't all part of a persecuted religious minority, right? But most importantly, and here's part of the big mystery, why did they land at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts? If you've done your opening assignment for this class, you know the first settlement was in Jamestown, was in Virginia. This group was supposed to be headed towards Virginia. If they were supposed to be heading to Virginia, how did they wind up in Massachusetts? Well, that's part of the mystery. Some textbooks will explain it as a simple navigation error. They got caught into a storm and they got lost. Well, this is certainly possible, but this is hundreds of miles off course. And no good captain would find himself that far off course. Seamen at the time, they had a very good understanding of latitude, how far away they were from the equator. Longitude was a tougher thing for them to measure, but they could pretty accurately measure their latitude. And so to be, several hundred miles off course like that, it's possible, but it certainly doesn't seem like the most likely explanation. So what are some other possibilities? Well, we know that this group wanted to separate themselves from other groups in England in the first place. So what about the possibility that they had a mutiny and took over the ship? This is something that some historians have proposed, that they purposely went to Massachusetts. They wanted to get far away from Virginia. They wanted to get far to the north, because even though they were supposed to be joining Virginia, they didn't want to. Well, technically, that would be breaking the law, and that would be breaking the trust of their investors. So if they did that, it'd be a pretty sneaky thing to do. And we don't want to think about our Pilgrims, our Puritans, as being sneaky, right? So which of those things is the truth? Well, we don't know for sure. We don't know. Right? And historians have fun trying to piece together the evidence and making a case for which of those theories they think the evidence supports the best. This is just one of many examples we'll see as we go through this course of times when historians don't really know the answer. And textbooks sometimes present it as if, well, this is what happened and it's the only way that it could have possibly happened. But the fun in history is knowing that things could have turned out differently, right? That events that happened were not inevitable. What we do know, of course, is the Plymouth colony suffered very similarly to Jamestown. That first winter, more than half of them died. Just like Jamestown, they didn't have enough food. They arrived at the wrong time of year. It was pretty miserable, and yet somehow they survived. And so let's give them an enormous amount of credit for the strength and determination it took to survive in this harsh environment. Eventually, they're going to form the colony of Massachusetts, and John Winthrop is going to be elected the first governor. Winthrop and this early colony in Massachusetts believed in a theocracy. Well, what the heck is that? Theocracy means the church and the state are one. So even though these people were escaping from religious persecution, they had no intent on providing religious freedom in this new world, right? They wanted everybody to follow their rules and do exactly what the church and the government, which were the same thing, right, wanted. So this brings us to another theme in my course that we'll explore throughout the year. And that is, whose history do we tell? Whose story do we tell? John Winthrop, being the governor of Massachusetts, left a lot of documents behind. And so historians have a lot to use to find out what he thought and his opinion and what he believed. And so Winthrop gets a lot of attention in history. But what about some other people who maybe don't get as much attention, right? Well, I think one of the things we're discovering again as historians is this argument over whose story do we tell. And there's two people in particular I love their story because they were people who were hundreds of years ahead of their time. One is Roger Williams, another member of this early separatist Christian community, but Williams believed in a separation of church and state. He thought it wasn't the government's job to be telling people in what way they should practice their faith. He is so far ahead of his time to be preaching that message, right? Which wasn't popular. He also believed that Native Americans should be compensated for their land, that they should be paid for the land the colonists were taking. Well, as you can imagine, this did not make Roger Williams very popular, and Williams is basically cast out. And he becomes the founder of what's now the state of Rhode Island, that later would become a hallmark of the Constitution and of America, and some of the things that we can be most proud of, this idea of freedom of religion, which is something that even now in the 21st century, many people around the planet do not enjoy, right? And here's this Roger Williams guy standing up and fighting for it against all these odds. Along with Roger Williams, there's a woman named Anne Hutchinson. And Anne is one of the first feminists. She preached in her home to both men and women. And this was completely breaking the rules, the laws of the church at the time. And so, like Roger Williams, she gets cast out. You know, Hutchinson bore 15 children. Can you imagine the hardships that these people endured and what they had to do just to survive? And this woman gives birth to 15 children and raises them and feeds them, and at the same time fights for women to have the right to speak up and be a part of the church. Amazing woman. Years ahead of her time, right? So, you know, who are the real heroes? Who are the real people we should be discussing? Well, I think most textbooks don't give enough due to Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. How about we get one more example here? The colonists got help from a Native American named Squanto. And this is true. And we have, how do we know this? Well, we have records, including the records of some of the colonists who mention that had it not been for Squanto teaching them what crops to plant and how and where to plant the food, they might not have survived at all. So the colonists themselves admit they owe their lives to Squanto. But usually the story is glossed over so fast to go to the next part that students are not taught to stop and think. Did you ever wonder, for example, how did they communicate with Squanto? How did Squanto know how to speak English in the first place? Well, it turns out it's because Squanto has a really interesting backstory. So Squanto was stolen from his village in 1605. And for 9 years, he worked at sea as slave labor on a Navy ship, right? In 1614, he was sold into slavery in Spain. Somehow, he escapes slavery in Spain and makes his way back to England, where eventually, in 1619, he convinces a Captain Dermer to let him crew on the boat in exchange to get back to Cape Cod. And so he spends all these years fighting to get back to his little village in Cape Cod, and he finally sets his foot on the shore. Can you imagine, after more than a decade of life as a slave, and he finally gets back to his village, only to discover his entire village is gone. They were all killed by an epidemic 2 years earlier, and the few survivors left to join other tribes. The colonists said he had to be sent by God for this purpose. Right? Well, whether he was sent by God or not, it certainly saved their lives. But what an amazing story, right, that Squanto has. And yet, this is another story that's often not talked about a lot in history.